Hello, Miss C again. We have amazingly managed to get ourselves to chapter 8 of Jekyll and Hyde. So it's quite a sort of long, complicated one in some ways. So I sort of sometimes go into this thinking I'll do one chapter and then it ends up being more. I'm not even going to make any assumptions today. I'm just going to go with it. If we can get through more than one, then we will. If we just have to go through just chapter 8, that's fine. We've left off with things getting a little bit dark, a little bit confusing, if you remember, because we have now seen the death of Lanyon. We have seen that Jekyll has completely shut himself away again after a very brief oh no, look, straight in my hair. After a very brief sort of, he starts to become a bit more social again, if you remember, when Hyde disappears. But we know that there's still something odd going on with Hyde, because it seems like he actually wrote a letter forging for Hyde so that everyone would think that Hyde had fled after the murder of Carew, when actually it might be that Jekyll is actually covering for him, sheltering him, forging for a murderer, as Utterson puts it. So Hyde isn't anywhere that we can see at the moment, but there still seems to be a sort of shadow hanging over Jekyll, because even though he came out for a little while when Hyde left, Jekyll then quite suddenly shut himself away again. Didn't want to see anyone, wouldn't even see Utterson. And for some linked reason, we assume, just because of the fact that Lanyon, when asked, won't talk about Jekyll anymore. Lanyon dies of some sort of shock that he experiences. If you need more information, you can always look at the videos of chapters 6 and 7, I think it is. But yeah, so Lanyon's dead. There's been a document left for Utterson that Lanyon left him, but Utterson isn't allowed to open it until the death or disappearance of a Henry Jekyll, which again, slightly odd considering that was also the wording in the will of when Hyde is due to get Jekyll's stuff if Jekyll is to die or disappear for 3 months. So there's an odd link there that hasn't been uncovered at all yet. Utterson, poor bloke, still none the wiser about what's going on. And aside from that, I think we're kind of caught up, really. So, okay, let's just start at the beginning of chapter 8. So at the beginning of chapter 8, it's called The Last Night, okay? And I have mentioned to you before, this is the last time that we actually see Utterson as our sort of protagonist, who we view the story sort of from, his perspective, because this is his final chapter. He doesn't die, but he does sort of, the last 2 chapters are narratives from other characters, okay, Lanyon and Jekyll. So let's make the most of our last little while with Utterson, because, he's all right, and we like Utterson, sort of. So he is at home, right? The chapter begins, he's at home, and it's made clear fairly early in the novel that it is quite a dark, windy, unseasonably cold, wild night in March, okay? Now, it's, again, we've got to remember the sort of gothic elements of this novel, the sort of the use of weather, the use of the sort of supernatural elements and things like that. So it is supposed to be set in a creepy, sort of foreboding scene. So Utterson's at home and he is disturbed from his routine of, I don't know what he does really, sitting around and reading books. I don't know. He's disturbed from doing this by Paul. Now, we remember Paul, don't we, everybody? He is the butler for Jekyll. We met him a few times here and there throughout the novel. So he comes to Utterson and he is looking not very good at all. He's looking really worried. And he essentially says, look, something's going on. I need you to come with me. And even at this point, even when he's turned up at the door and needs Utterson to go with him, even at this point, he still doesn't tell Utterson what's going on. But Utterson, bless him, up he gets, coat goes on, off they go into the London sort of night, okay, the wild weather of sort of driving through London in the dark and the cold and the wind. And Utterson himself gets a bit of a sense of sort of foreboding as they drive through. So they're driving through London, and Utterson is sort of like, what's going on? Okay, what is going on here? And over the course of the sort of next part of the chapter, as Utterson sort of arrives at the house, and we'll talk about that bit in a minute, as that all unfolds, we find out that Paul is very worried about Jekyll, Jekyll being his master, of course. And essentially, Jekyll hasn't been out of his sort of laboratory, his on the other side of the house. You know, he's sort of been associated now with the back part of the house, usually associated more with Hyde and the sort of more neglected, sordid side of things, because it's darker, it's less welcoming, the doorway, you remember all that. But Jekyll has shut himself away in his sort of laboratory and the other room in his in that sort of area. And Paul's essentially says, I'm worried that foul play has happened. Okay, he's concerned that something has been done to Jekyll, because he says, well, again, as it unravels, we'll find out what it is he actually thinks. But let's sort of start with what actually gets said. So at this point early on, it's not sort of made explicit, because again, we still have this weird veil of secrecy. So Utterson's kind of made to wait for a while to actually be told what Paul is actually thinking about the situation. But he is worried about foul play, and he's obviously very scared. And again, at this point with his sort of, you know, job, it would be his job to be quite discreet and to be quite, you know, appropriate. So the fact that he's going out and sort of sharing his master's business with his master's friend shows the level of fear that he's clearly feeling. Anyway, so when Utterson gets to the house, he finds that all of the servants of the house are gathered together in the main hall, where there's a fire, sort of, you know, like in the fireplace, almost as if they're too scared to sort of be on their own in other sort of darker, less populated parts of the house. So they've all gathered together. And when Utterson arrives, one of the female sort of servants sort of says, oh, bless God, it's Utterson, and almost looks as if she's going to run forward and hug him in relief that he's there. So again, very unseemly behaviour. And Utterson, being that Victorian gent, being that man who's very aware of convention and what you should and shouldn't do, he sort of says, now, what is all this? You know, would your master be happy that you were away from your post, you weren't working? And so that sort of is the mood that he walks into. There's essentially a house full of very scared servants who aren't giving a huge amount away as to what's going on. So what they do is Paul sort of says, right, come with me, okay? And off they go, him and Utterson, across the sort of the nice part of the house, across the courtyard and over to where the steps up to sort of the laboratory is and everything. And the story that Paul tells is essentially, and this might be slightly out of order of the chapter because I don't have the chapter in front of me, but this is the story that he sort of tells. He says, for the last amount of time, okay, so recently, things have been getting really dark and really weird. And my master, i.e. Jekyll, won't come out of his room. We hear sort of like stomping up and down at all hours of the day and night. Things are feeling really, really odd. The only time that he will sort of communicate with us, because he's just shut away all the time, the only time that he seems to communicate with us is when he is requesting and leaving notes outside his room, requesting for us to go and find this certain drug, right? This certain powder drug that he is seemingly desperate to get his hands on. And he has been, it turns out, sending Paul all over London to all the different sort of like drug pharmacy apothecaries to try and find this certain drug. And he will sort of, basically Paul will come back and he will give them what they found. He will be quiet for a little while in his room, and then he starts shouting and screaming and sort of sounding really upset again. And apparently he sort of wails and sounds like this sort of, you know, like something terrible is going on in there. And Utterson's sort of like, okay, that sounds bad. And basically Paul, over the course of the chapter, gets closer and closer to saying to Utterson what it is he really wants to say. And what it is he really wants to say is, I don't think it's Jekyll in there anymore. I think actually it's someone else. I think that Jekyll has been made away with, all right? And I suspect it's been foul play. Obviously, we now get the glaring impression that it's Hyde in there. And that is what sort of the assumption turns out to be as this chapter wears on. What it's assumed is, by Paul this is that the Hyde has murdered Jekyll and has taken his place inside this room. But Utterson, listening to this and listening to what he said about the fact that he keeps sending someone out to get drugs, and then he sort of sends someone else out again once that seems to not work and whatever else. So what Utterson sort of says is, well, I don't think you can jump to that conclusion. I think actually maybe it's that he's really ill, and it is him in there. But Paul calls out to Jekyll through the door just to say, oh, I think he says, he just calls something through the door. I can't remember what it is because he doesn't want to tell him that Utterson's there, because he says to Utterson, basically they get to the door and Paul's a bit like, right, you need to be quiet now. Be quiet. I'm going to sort of call out to him and I want you to listen and hear how this voice sounds when he calls back, because it's supposed to be Jekyll, right? So I'm just looking at what I want to do. Okay, let's try this today. Let's go mad. So he essentially calls out to Jekyll and says, like, hello, your mate's here to see you, kind of thing. And at this, a voice cries out like, no, he doesn't say that. No, I'm talking nonsense. A voice, basically, he calls out something to Jekyll through the door. And the voice inside sort of calls something back out. And at that, Paul looks at Utterson and is like, see, that doesn't sound like Jekyll, does it? That doesn't sound like Jekyll. And Utterson, remember, he is a lover of the sane and customary sides of life. So this isn't something that he's sort of he doesn't like the fact that there's all these histrionics going on and all this panic going on. And so he sort of says, look, I think I've come to a much more sensible conclusion as to what this is all about. And he leads Paul away. So they sort of go away from the sort of staircase with the doorway so that they can't be overheard. And they go away and he says, look, what I think it is, I think Jekyll is actually really poorly. I think Jekyll has got some sort of wasting disease. And this wasting disease is resulting in the fact that Jekyll is now not wanting to go out because he's embarrassed of how he now looks. It's changed the way his voice sounds, which is why that doesn't sound like Jekyll in there anymore. And, that's why he's probably searching for this specific drug, because he wants to cure himself, right? So Utterson's like, I've got it sorted, mate. I know exactly what's wrong with this dude. Now, in theory, that makes complete sense. But Paul isn't having it, because Paul is like, well, hang on a minute. He says, what difference does the fact that you think he's ill make? I've seen him. I've seen him. And Utterson goes, what do you mean? Who have you seen? And he says, I've seen someone that isn't Jekyll skulking around out here in the courtyard looking for things when he thinks no one's around, right? And he says he jumped like a monkey between the crates. He's small, he's hunched over, his face, oh, he's awful. And obviously we kind of know now, and Utterson really does as well, he's making reference to Hyde, isn't he? And he essentially now starts to make it more obvious he thinks Hyde has murdered Jekyll. But Utterson is still kind of like, okay, but why would he stay in there? Why would he stay in there if he's murdered Jekyll? Like, what good is it doing him staying somewhere where he is wanted for murder? To which Paul can't really answer. And so the long and short of it is, Paul says, look, I think Hyde did it. Hyde's murdered Jekyll. Jekyll's in there dead, potentially, and Hyde isn't leaving. We need to get him. And so what Utterson says is, he says, look, if you tell me this, we have to do something about it. Like, we can't then leave it, all right? If you tell me this, that's it. I will have to get this door broken down and we will have to follow up with whatever then happens. And Paul's like, yeah, thank God. That's what I wanted to do all along. Brilliant. Let's do that. So remember, there is a back entrance to the house, which is what Hyde was coming and going by anyway. And at this point, the back entrance to the house is, they send some of the servants out to that side of the house in order to make sure that if he tries to make an escape that way, he can't. And then Paul and Utterson stay at the door that they're at. And essentially, they get ready. I think Utterson at this point has like an axe or something. And they get ready to fight, essentially, I suppose. And one last time, Utterson calls out and he says, like, Jekyll, I'm here to see you, kind of thing. And a voice cries out in a sort of complaining tone, like, have mercy on me, like, leave me alone, kind of thing. And at that, Utterson goes, that is not Jekyll's voice, that is Hyde's voice, get that door down. So at that point, Utterson is completely on board and he's like, no, we need to do something about this, like, now. So they break the door down, and after bashing on the door a few times with the axe, they get the door down and they get into the room. And when they're in the room, they look around and they see that there is a dead body on the floor. Now, whose dead body is it, you ask? Whose dead body is it indeed? It is the body of a Mr. Edward Hyde. And he is dead, and it looks from the crushed sort of, like, it says a phial, P-H-I-A-L, like a test tube, basically. From the crushed test tube in his hand, it looks like he's a self-destroyer, as they call him, okay? And he's also, looks like he's very, very recently done it. And we know that because he was just calling out to Utterson to have mercy and not break in, wasn't he? So at this point, they can see that Hyde has killed himself. But the strange thing about it is that he seems to be wearing clothes that are far too big for him. In fact, it describes them as clothes of the doctor's bigness. What's that all about, we all ask? So that's obviously the end of Hyde. And at this point, they sort of have a little look around the laboratory that they are in, and everything looks sort of fairly standard for the sort of place that it is. Fine. But the one thing they sort of notice, which is important for the next chapter, or the next couple of chapters, is that there is another package of documents, because we love a package of documents, don't we? We love it. So there's a package of documents underneath, sort of in a cupboard somewhere, or sort of put away somewhere. And again, it's for the attention of Gabriel Utterson. And in it, there are a couple of things, okay? The first thing that's in it is a copy of Jekyll's will. And in this copy of Jekyll's will, we see that it's been changed. And no longer is Edward Hyde the benefactor of Jekyll's fortune. Now it's been changed back to, aside from the servants getting their, their bits and pieces, whatever they need, everything else, his fortune, goes to Gabriel Utterson. So it's been changed. There's also a letter in there for Utterson that basically says, like, hi, if you're reading this, then, something has happened to me. What I want you to do is, I know from our last encounter that you were given a document from Lanyon, and I'm going to request that you go home and read that. Once you've read that, if you still feel like you want to, and if you still feel like you're able to, then please read the last document that's enclosed here. Please read my sort of confession, my statement. So there is also another document in it that is going to be essentially chapter 10, which is Jekyll's statement of the case, all right? And so Utterson, which is interesting again, duality and all that, because Utterson really at this point should be going straight to the police, because Hyde's dead, yes, but where's Jekyll? We haven't seen him. We don't know where he's gone. We assume that Hyde killed him. But the strange thing is, that back door that he was coming and going by, when those two people, the servants, went out to the back door to make sure he couldn't escape that way, they found the door locked. And when Utterson and Paul start looking around inside, they find the key to that door rusted and broken. So no one could have got out that way, because obviously the door was locked and the key was inside. So that means they were like, well, Jekyll still has to be here then, because how could he have gotten him? Or he's buried under the floorboards. And so they sort of look around to see how that could happen, but it's like flagstones, it's like stone. So, you know, it's not like you could easily bury someone like that. So they're all really, really confused. I thought children were back and going to disturb me. So obviously they're understandably very confused about the whole situation, okay? They don't understand. So Utterson, even though he knows he should phone the police, he says to Paul, he says, look, I've got to go home. I've got to read some of these bloody documents that I've not been allowed to read for a book. I'm going to go home. I need to read what's going on. I need to read these statements. And then when I come back, we will decide what we're going to do. And at this point, essentially, we say bye-bye Utterson, because it's now on to chapter 9 and 10. And those two chapters, as I've said, are embedded narratives. They're stories about, they're sort of parts of the story that are filling in gaps that we've already sort of come to. So, for example, the Lanyon narrative that we'll go on to now is going to fill in what happened to Lanyon, why he died. And obviously the final chapter, in theory, you could just read that and you would understand what's happened in the novel. So let's move on to chapter 9 then. So we say goodbye, Utterson. He's gone now. We'll miss you very much, mate. See you another time. And we assume that he's obviously gone to then go and read these documents. So we're essentially, I suppose we could imagine that we're reading these with him, couldn't we? But what we read now is Lanyon and his version of sort of events. So his account of what happened in the run up to him dying. So if you can imagine, he's written this letter after he's had whatever awful shock it was, whatever awful shock that he's experienced has led him to write this letter, because he knows he's going to die. Okay, so hopefully you can sort of follow that. So let's begin. Now this gets a bit confusing because there's yet another document within this document, because what he starts off by saying, remember, this is all in first person from Lanyon's perspective. So chapter 9 is Dr. Lanyon's narrative, okay? And basically what he says in this is he goes, so the other day, so the other day I was at home, sort of, you know, minding my own business, blah, blah, blah. And I happened to get a letter delivered to me, right? And then he puts the letter in. So there's now a sort of letter within this narrative, a letter within a letter, if you will. And in this letter he reads, it's from his friend Jekyll, okay? And it's not a long letter. It's just a letter saying basically like, hi, I hope you know that even though we've not really been friends for a while, I hope you know that if you ever were to need me, and if, you know, something really important depended on you helping me, like me helping you, I would in a heartbeat. I'd do anything you needed. And then sort of in the very next sentence, he's like, so yeah, mate, I really need your help, basically. And so he says, I need you to do me a favour. My entire being, my entire life essentially is in your hands now. If you don't agree to do this, like, I'm going to die, basically. So, you know, no pressure or anything. And he says, I need you to go to my laboratory in my house. Paul will let you in. And what I need you to do, really annoying thing about the Fenty mascara, you can't put it down because it's like, I don't know if you can see that, but it's like a sort of strange, yeah. Anyway, what he says is, I need you to go to my laboratory, and in a certain drawer in my laboratory, there will be some So basically just, I need you to bring a drawer, a whole drawer, to your house to be collected by someone tonight, right? And he says there'll be like a book in there, there'll be some other bits and pieces, but it will be this particular drawer. And he explains it really clearly. He's like, it's the third one up or the second one down. It's on this side, blah, blah, blah. And he's really specific. And he says, please go now. Please make sure you're there. And someone will be around to collect this drawer at like midnight tonight or whatever it is, okay? So Lanyon, then it goes to his narrative again, so it's all in first person, and he's curious, obviously. So he goes and does it, all right? He goes and does it. And he gets this stuff, and he does have a little look at it. And one of the things he finds in this drawer is a book. And he said the book wasn't massively like forthcoming in what it meant, because a lot of it was just a series of dates that dated back years. All right. Now, again, once we read chapter 10, all of these gaps will be filled in too. So all these dates, and it said on a lot of the dates, it was written things like failure, total failure. Other ones, it said things like double and things like that. Again, without us knowing what that book is, which we will later, that's obviously going to be fairly confusing. We don't know what this is all about. So he's found this book, and there's some sort of chemicals in there as well. And he knows that this, whoever's coming to get it, he doesn't know who it's going to be, will be coming at midnight. And he does start to get a little bit scared, because it's a really odd letter to get. Bearing in mind, at this point, him and Jekyll sort of, I think they've sort of seen each other again, remember, because Jekyll did start being a bit more sociable. But it's not like they're sort of best mates and have been really close for years. They were distant, and now we've got this strange request coming. So he actually gets his gun ready and waits with that, because he's a little bit nervous for this midnight to come, okay? So he waits, and at midnight there is a knock on the door. So he goes to answer it. And obviously, bearing in mind, Lanyon has never met Hyde. So at this point, he just describes him as like, well, I didn't know who this man was. He was small, he was hunched over, but he was wearing clothes far too big for him, all right? Again, we've got a little bit of a link here, haven't we? So he was wearing clothes too big for him. He was quite sort of rough, and, he didn't seem to know how to speak politely, because he sort of went, have you got it? And I think Lanyon, in the same way, if you remember, Utterson does this to Hyde early on when Hyde is rude to him at the doorway. And he sort of says, like, that is not fitting language, come now. And Lanyon does a similar sort of thing. He's like, look, mate, come on, play the game. I've just done you a favour. And Hyde sort of, obviously, again, it's not said that it's Hyde yet, but it will in a minute. Hyde sort of settles himself a little bit, and he's like, sorry, but I really do need that stuff. So he gets the drawer. Okay, and he starts faffing around making whatever it is that he needs to make with the chemicals and stuff. And Lanyon just sort of watches him. And at that point, once he's sort of faffed around and done that, he's finished. And he stands up, and he basically says to him, look, I'm done. I can leave now and never bother you again. I recommend you just let me walk out of this house, and you don't need to know what it is that I am about to do. You don't need to know what it is that links me to Jekyll. Like, this can just be something that you forget. But he gives him a second option. He sort of says, look, essentially, like, you kind of have done me a favour, and, if you really want to have your entire being, your entire existence brought into question, if you want to question who you are, if you want to question what the world is, shake your very foundations, I'll take it right here. But like, basically, don't say I didn't warn you. Now, there are allusions here, I've read. There are allusions here to sort of the story of creation in Genesis, in the Bible, in the sense that the serpent actually does a similar thing to Eve, in the sense that she's sort of, like, obviously in the story of creation, it's said that obviously no one forces Eve to eat that apple. Yeah, no one forces her. The snake, the serpent, just sort of tempts her by going, look, if you eat this apple, all of the secrets of, you know, the world and all of the things that you don't know, you will then know, you will understand. And obviously that's a really, you know, very difficult to say no to proposition, isn't it? I'm going to go really pink. It might be a disaster. So there is an allusion, I think, here to the Bible in the sense that Lanyon's need for knowledge and his desire to know more gets in the way of maybe his logic or what he should do. And he said to Hyde, no, I want to see what's going to happen. And remember, we kind of know by this point, because we know what? We know the story of Jekyll and Hyde, because Jekyll and Hyde has so many connotations anyway. But a Victorian reader of the time would not know what's about to happen. They genuinely wouldn't. They might have suspicions because they've been reading the book and have sort of, you know, worked it out, but they wouldn't know. Okay. So with that in mind, we then see Hyde take this potion. Right? He takes the potion and Lanyon watches him take the potion. And he watches him start to transform. He watches this horrendous sort of terrifying transformation take place in front of his very eyes. And he is horrified by it. He describes it as, you know, this horrifying experience. And he sort of watched this man seem to almost like melt in front of him. And, you know, he couldn't work out what was going on. And he's sort of, whatever it is, it's horrifying and terrifying. Okay, I don't know what I did with my eyes, but I'm kind of, that's fun. That'll do. Right, so last little bit then. So he watches him and eventually he sees that this man, this dwarfish, strange man that's turned up at his house is now Jekyll. He's turned into Jekyll. And at that point, he realises that obviously that means that when Jekyll explains to him as well, Hyde, who murdered Carew, who is wanted all through London, which is why he came at the dead of night, which is why he was all hunched over and scared, which is why he was so desperate to turn back into Jekyll. We'll get on to why he couldn't turn into Jekyll without help in chapter 10. But this guy is wanted all over London as a murderer, and Lanyon has just witnessed proof that Jekyll's the reason Hyde even existed, because they're the same person to a point, right? So this is what has shook Lanyon to his core. This is what has changed Lanyon's view on everything. Because remember, he believed in the sane and the sort of black and white type medicine and science. He saw Jekyll's experiments as too fanciful. He didn't understand the importance of the sort of stuff that Jekyll was doing. He didn't agree with it. And now he's had all of his beliefs about that not being, you know, accurate science, that being silly, that not being worth it, completely blown out of the water. On top of that, he's watched his best friend sort of materialise after someone takes a potion. On top of this, he realises that his friend is essentially responsible for the murder of an innocent man. So all in all, it's a pretty nasty experience for Lanyon. Sends him to an early grave. And he says, I'm haunted now. You know, I'm haunted by horrible realisations about life and horrible dreams. And I you know, what life has become to me. I can't survive this, and I don't think I want to. And that's his narrative. That's how it ends, that particular chapter. He's sort of, you know, he's signing off like, yeah, I'm going to die. But what I do think is important to remember is he didn't want this read. He didn't want Jekyll's cover to be blown until Jekyll died or disappeared. So even though he was horrified and regarded Jekyll as dead to him, there was still, can we say that there is still like a loyalty that he holds towards Jekyll? He's still kind of a good dude to do that, right? He should have reported him, and he didn't. He told us, and do not read this until Jekyll has either died or disappeared. So I suppose we could argue Lanyon remains a good bloke until the very end. And then we have it. So we've had chapter 8 and 9 now, and then we've got chapter 10, which is a big old beast. It's quite chunky. So we'll do that in our next video. Yeah. And hopefully that's a bit clearer for you and you have followed up to this point. And we will move on to the final chapter in the next video. See you later.